Hello BookTube and AuthorTube. This is the road to NaNoWriMo. Ordinarily on Wednesdays I have a writing update video, or I try to have a writing update video. For the next 2 months, for September and October, my Writing Wednesday videos will be the road to NaNoWriMo, where I will talk about basically the preparation for my NaNoWriMo project. And then in November, it will be the NaNoWriMo update. Anyway, so what is NaNoWriMo? NaNoWriMo is a massive project in November where people who would like to try their hand at writing novels, or who write novels as a hobby, can hunker down and write the novel they've been working on, or they've always wanted to write, or what have you. I've tried 2 NaNoWriMos 2 years in a row, in 2018 and 2019, and I didn't have much success in 2018. 2019 I did complete the project, although about halfway from the word count. So anyway, but I'm looking forward to having another go at NaNoWriMo, and this time I want to do bring you along as I kind of work on the project of figuring out what I'm going to write and how I'm going to write it. So let's begin with the kernel, the bit of grit that is pestering me, that is worrying me, that I have to get it out. I have to have a fight with it. And so the concept of sort of story as pearl, where there's sort of a grit of an idea or theme that is gradually worked on and worked on and worked on until it becomes a pearl. I'm getting from Andy Schmidt's book on writing comics. I'm blanking on the title right now. So that's kind of how I'm approaching this. So what is this grit, this worrying idea, topic, subject that I'm obsessing over, that I just have to work on and just figure out what my thoughts are on it and hash it out? It's going to be my relationship, my loathing, my affection for my hometown. Like a lot of young gay men growing up in a small town that's not really, doesn't offer them anything. It's basically a path to somewhere else. You cannot wait to get out of this rat trap, this road to nowhere. At the same time, I remember growing up, my hometown was not doing as very well as I was growing up. Several major businesses closed. Other opportunities for getting new factories in were scuttled by local ordinances. I mean, the city's doing better now, significantly better now. But at the time, it was really struggling. And I remember the editor of the local paper writing an editorial about the best place to live, that it's really a small town is the best place to raise a family. And I had a lot of arguments with that. I mean, of course, it is if you're looking for one thing, and assuming you can find it in a small town. But if you're looking for other things, if you're interested in other things, a small town can be hell. I mean, in any number of ways. So that's really the kernel, that's the grit that's obsessing me is this sort of mixed loathing and affection I have for my hometown. Obviously, the main thrust is going to be the loathing part, but I think I'm going to try to undercut it with some forms of affection. Although, depending on how I decide to take the story, which we'll get to here in a sec, exactly how the undercutting kind of plays out. Although I don't know necessarily if I'm going to do a thing where the character loathes the town, but then also ultimately saves it and doesn't try to change anything about it. And especially that which makes him loathe it. Because that is one thing that, when it comes to science fiction and fantasy tropes, the sort of crapsack world that the hero has to save because they're the hero and they have to save it, but nothing ever really changes, drives me absolute insane. It's like a pet peeve of mine. I can rant about that all day long. Anyway, so what are my options for telling the story? I have 3 ideas for the genre. Obviously it's going to be a novel, but like breaking it down to even further. So my first idea is realistic fiction. I could say literary fiction, but I'm not going to be presumptuous. I don't think I really have the talent yet to really sort of aspire to literary fiction. Even though literary fiction is basically a catch-all term for realistic fiction. That's not necessarily in any other genre. But, so why realistic fiction? Obviously if you've subscribed, you've seen my videos for any length of time. I started BookTube concentrating very heavily on science fiction and fantasy. And in fact, that was my goal originally for starting my BookTube channel, was to provide a voice for science fiction and fantasy in this corner of BookTube, where there's a greater concentration on literary fiction, on more classic fiction. Of course, Steve Donahue and Mark Richardson discuss science fiction too, although they tend to focus more heavily on classic science fiction and fantasy. But there really isn't as much discussion of more current or contemporary science fiction and fantasy. And also focusing on more adult science fiction and fantasy, whereas a lot of science fiction and fantasy discussion is usually YA or middle grade. Of course, there's like Thomas of SF-180, who is great, and others, which I might actually do a video on that, if I remember. So I started off focusing heavily on science fiction and fantasy, and then at the beginning of this year, I fell deeply in love with history and nonfiction in general, and as more than just a sort of inspiration engine for writing science fiction and fantasy, I fell in love with history for itself. It's the quality of the writing and all of that. So I haven't really discussed a whole lot of my relationship with more realistic fiction or literary fiction. When I was in college, I focused more heavily on literary fiction. I wanted to be an English professor, although focusing more on scholarship than on the teaching. But so I was very heavily, I read more heavily in literary fiction than I did science fiction and fantasy. And I actually wanted to write a bit of a mix of both. I did take several, 2 creative writing classes in college as electives. Probably should have used one of those electives for an art class, but hindsight's 20/20. Anyway, And the projects I wrote were more realistic, more literary. Although I did also want to write some science fiction and fantasy. I've always, as long as I've wanted to write, I've kind of wanted to try a balance. Although the scales have tipped more heavily into science fiction and fantasy at the moment. So anyway, so I've rambled quite enough about the history of why I kind of want to write realistic, a realistic novel. Also, part of it I think is also form, style. There's a style I tend to gravitate towards that I'm not entirely sure it really fits with science fiction and fantasy, although it would be a really great challenge to see if I can make it work. And that might be something I will try here too, depending if I decide to go in a different direction than a realistic fiction or a realistic novel. So basically, a realistic novel will basically partially be inspired or draw from life, not necessarily autobiographical, certainly not autofiction. So you don't have to worry, Steve. Although some scenes, if I decide to include them, I kind of sort of wish they were real. But anyway, so that's generally realistic. I mean, I've wanted to try my hand at a longer realistic project than a long short story or novelette. So from a realistic novel, I also kind of wanted to do a more realistic fantasy or a contemporary fantasy. I'm not necessarily thrilled with the term contemporary fantasy, and obviously it's been largely superseded by urban fantasy. So I'm kind of toying with maybe some form of fantastic realism or realistic fantasy. And in this situation, it would be very much the same as the realistic, the base setting and a lot of the plots. But I would include a witch or magic, ghosts, some form of cryptid, stuff like that. Also do something maybe a bit more with the town, giving it a bit of an antagonistic spirit or something. So I'll see where that goes. And then moving even further, secondary world fantasy. Now, for those of you who don't know, a secondary world fantasy is a fantasy set in a world that the writer made up. So this would be, say, Middle Earth, or Westeros, or I'm blanking on the name of it, but you get the idea. The world's made up. And there I would probably incorporate elements of, like, say, steampunk and diesel punk, maybe hints of a weird western and weird fiction, maybe a little bit of the Southern Gothic, which would also, in Gothic fiction, which would also maybe play a bit of a role in the more realistic fantasy too. So those are my plans. And as we work my way through sort of like talking more and more about the various ideas I have, we'll probably settle on, okay, is it going to be realistic? Is it going to be a contemporary or realistic fantasy? Is it going to be a secondary fantasy? And what research I need to do, because very much the research, which I'll talk about in the next video, will be basically a pile-up. It starts with a base for the realistic fantasy, and then it kind of gradually expands out as from like the contemporary fantasy or realistic fantasy and the secondary world fantasy. So that's so far what I've got. I have about 5 pages of notes, which if you're interested in, we might try some, or I might go through and give a selection of what I've got so far, and we can go from there. Or I might do sort of like what I immediately think I need to do more research on. So it could be either like looking at the notes and also working on what I need to research. So that's, I think, a good place to wrap up before I start to ramble. Yeah, so thank you, BookTube. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe and have a great afternoon. Thank you.